And welcome to World Oregon's webinar today, June 3rd, on 7 Doors, Stories of Immigration, Detention with Greg Constantine, Warren Binford, and Michael Garcia Bochenek. And we are really honored to have everyone here in the audience and these 3 distinguished panelists. Just a few short words before Greg starts us off with a presentation and sharing some of his documentary photos. Just a reminder that this is a free World Oregon webinar. We thank those of you who are members for helping make this possible. If you're not a member, I encourage you to consider joining on our website. And would appreciate you remembering that we are a nonpartisan organization, and so we're looking at the substance of this issue rather than the partisan politics of what can often be the case in immigration issues, and really looking at the human rights aspects of it. Excuse me. Today's webinar, all the audience members will be muted with your video off, as is normal for the Zoom webinars, and the 3 panels will have their video on and audio on, depending on who is speaking. This is being recorded, as you probably just heard the Zoom robo announcement, for posting later on YouTube. So just keep that in mind. And hope that if you you can join us next week, where we have a couple great programs coming up on China, and also the week after, China on Tuesday, and then on Thursday, Tim Tran, American Dreamer, his autobiography of an incredible story. We just added also the last day of the month, a Pride Month event, Pride with the Purpose, looking at LGBTQ rights internationally. So hope you can join us for that. Now, without further ado, I'm going to jump into today's program. Again, it's 7 Doors, and I'll do short introductions. Their full bios are on the website, and we'll be posting some links where you can get more information in the chat. Again, my apologies for any confusion. There was a glitch in the email about the start time that we got sorted out, so apologize if there's any confusion on that. While the presenters are making their comments and presentations, feel free to add questions in the Q&A. Reminder to please keep them germane to the presentation at hand. The first presenter will be Greg Constantine, who is a documentary photographer who's done multiple programs with us and has some incredible photos to share. Second is Warren Binford will help then moderate the discussion. She's a professor of law and the director of the clinical law program at Willamette University, and she's also presented for us in the past. And Michael Garcia Bochenek, who is the first time that he is with us, and we're thrilled to have. We've done work with Human Rights Watch in the past, and it's great to have him join us as well. And they'll be having a robust discussion. Then we'll start weaving in your questions with my colleague, Tim DeRoche, our director of programs. So you've met our distinguished panelists. We're now going to give the floor to Greg. Thanks so much, Greg, and looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Hey, thanks so much. Really appreciate Derek and Tim and World Oregon, and I'm really pleased to be on this panel with Warren and Michael as well. I'm going to spend about 10 to 12 minutes just sharing a lot of photography and giving everybody a bit of context behind the work that I've done, the motivation behind it, some of the stories behind some of the pictures, but clearly, this discussion is all about the issue of immigration detention and how that has become an incredibly central part to a lot of immigration and asylum policies that governments have put in place around the world. I work on really long-term kind of large documentary projects that kind of take a look at issues that are taking place all over the world so that people can compare and kind of contrast what is happening and what different governments are doing and what connections they might have. And all of this is sparked to try to sew together and tie these different stories from different parts of the globe together as a way to show that there's this common kind of denominator in terms of injustices that are being done to people through these kind of policies. I started this particular project 7 Doors. It would have been in the beginning of 2017. I'm going to switch over to sharing my screen now. So give me 1 second here. There we go. I started this project Seven Doors in early 2017. And basically how this whole entire project came about was I had spent 12 years working on a project that looked at stateless communities all around the world, ethnic communities and individuals that for any number of reasons, but primarily because of discrimination, intolerance, and racism, had been arbitrarily deprived or stripped of their citizenship by governments. And the last particular part of that huge body of work was looking at the challenges that stateless people in Europe faced because of this condition and because of the deprivation of nationality. And I thought I had heard every single story of stateless people around the world over those 12 years. But when I started to work in Europe, I started to hear some news stories that I'd never heard before. And that was the challenges that stateless people in Europe faced by going in and out of immigration detention multiple times over years because they either had no documents, they couldn't prove their citizenship, and they just went through this cycle of incarceration through immigration detention systems. And that really sparked my interest in this subject. And I knew that that was going to be the next project. This filtering of finishing the work in of the project Nowhere People into the project Seven Doors started, like I said, in Europe, but it would have started in detention centers like this in Italy outside of Rome. It would have started with the stories of people who had gone in and out of immigration detention, like this young man outside in Amsterdam, who had been in immigration detention several times, but was now living in a facility that had been a previous jail, but this is where migrants were being housed, could be provided housing for. Also in places like in Rotterdam, places like in Malta, Poland, etc. It was a springboard for this huge project because I really wanted to know a couple of different things. I wanted to know what do these immigration detention systems actually look like in different places around the world? But more importantly, how do these policies impact people in their everyday lives? And how can a project like this using photography push and challenge people to develop even further how they define what detention actually is, from something that is just confined to the walls of a physical detention center to more of the psychological impact that detention has on people, not only when they're in detention, but also at the same time after they've been released from detention. And so that really sparked me to dive into this project. I started kind of the project in Malaysia, but one of my primary focuses was the United Kingdom. This is Collinbrook, Harmondsworth Detention Center outside of London Heathrow. And in 2020, there was roughly 25,000 people in the UK were held in immigration detention. You'll see that there's a kind of a continuity between policies with a lot of different countries around the world. People having to wait in lines for their immigration check-ins, which provide a huge amount of stress for people because they have no idea what's going to happen to them when they go into that room. This would be Lunar House in Croydon, which is a major check-in center for people in the United Kingdom when they have to go in, present themselves, and a lot of times they have no idea what's going to happen to them. And oftentimes you hear stories of people actually taking bags with them because they have no idea if they're going to end up going in and checking and then being put in detention for any number of reasons. But you'll see over time again throughout this series of pictures that I show, there's going to be stories behind the people. And the program or the project Seven Doors actually was titled from a conversation that I had with this very man in this photograph. This was taken in the UK, and this was a man from Africa who had been in detention in the UK for several years. And upon release, he was talking to me about his experience, and he basically said that I was in detention for so many years, and when I was freed and they let me out, I remember having to walk through 7 different doors from my cell to the door where they basically said, okay, you're free now. And his response was, well, how can I be free? Because this experience has traumatized me so much. I'm always going to feel like I'm in detention. Part of the project is also looking at the kind of the challenges that are being faced by civil society groups around the world. And this is a group of volunteers who are working in a call center in the UK, answering phone calls from people who are in detention, trying to find legal support and just emotional support. The first big essay that I did for 7 Doors was in Malaysia. I spent several months working over a course of several months working on the issue of immigration detention in Malaysia. And this was primarily in 2017, which at the time, there were 47,000 people being held in immigration detention in Malaysia through 15 different detention centers, spread out all around the country. At that particular time, there was very aggressive movements from Malaysian immigration to find people who were undocumented. And this could be through raids happening all across the country at the time, even including in high touristed areas. The fear of immigration detention permeates through the immigrant community in any country that you go to. This is a particular example of the byproduct of that fear, meaning that when a woman heard that immigration was raiding her apartment in downtown Kuala Lumpur, she hid in the attic, in the ceiling of her apartment. And after immigration had left, she actually burst through accidentally through the ceiling of her apartment where she was hiding. Again, immigration sweeps through downtown Kuala Lumpur, trying to find people that then would end up being held in immigration detention for an indefinite period of time often. We'll talk about how immigration detention affects children and families, but in pretty much every country that I've been to, children have been detained in one capacity or another. And the repercussions that detention has, not only on the children, but extended family, like these 2 mothers who both of their children were in immigration detention in Malaysia, is heartbreaking. Or this particular story of a man whose wife was undocumented and a nurse turned her in to immigration authorities. And right after their newborn baby was born, the mother and the child were arrested at the hospital and put in immigration detention. Another kind of thing that this project tries to unearth or try to explore a little bit are programs that are trying to do alternative to detention, where civil society groups are putting in programs that provide a different kind of space for people to live in, whether it's case management or alternative physical spaces for people to live in while their asylum claims are being heard through the courts, like this young gentleman in Malaysia as well. I spent time in Mexico too, and primarily in southern Mexico, whereas pre-COVID times, most people, when they associate immigration detention to North America, they automatically assume it's all happening in the United States. But actually in Mexico at pre-COVID, there were roughly 180,000 people went through the immigration detention system in Mexico. There are 52 different sites, some of them large, some of them very small, that are actually detaining immigrants all throughout Mexico. This is the largest immigration detention center in all of all of Latin America in Tapachula. It roughly holds about 900 people, but often accommodates many more. You'll see that this migratory path that people take through Central America to get to the United States or to claim asylum in Mexico accommodates people from all over the world, including people from Cuba, Haiti, and like this group of people, all who had made their way from Africa to South America and then made their way through Central America to reach Mexico, where some of them would have claimed asylum in Mexico, while others would end up trying to find a way to the United States. Detention of children has been continuously a problem in Mexico. Up until last November, which was initiated this year, the Mexican government had been detaining children like this child in the Mexico City Immigration Detention Center, just outside of in the heart of Mexico City. The project tries to tell the stories of people, but also I've spent a lot of time just trying to provide a different visual translation of what these immigration detention systems look like around the world, and also interview people to share that traumatic experience. The majority of the rest of the material that I'm going to share is all work that's been done for a large 3-part photo testimonial series called American Gulag, which looks at the immigration detention system, but also the impact that it has on people in the United States. I grew up in the United States, and I think a lot of people are conscious that there is this immigration detention system in the United States, but nobody really knows what it actually looks like. And nobody really knows how vast it actually is. So one of the three parts that I've tried to do with this work is to provide this new kind of visual map, this visual architecture and translation of what the system actually looks like in the United States and what we can pull out of this. These are a series of panoramics that I did for the first part of the essay, American Gulag. And the intention of this series was to kind of show in so many ways the intentionality behind where immigration detention centers, most of them are run by for-profit private prison companies, where they're actually constructed in a way that also kind of mirrors the desolate isolation that people feel and exist in when they are being detained. This is like in Tacoma, Washington. I mean, most of these detention centers are constructed, describe it, they're buried in the nothingness of something. They're either buried in the nothingness of an industrial area within a city that nobody would even know exists. They're buried within a desert, or they're buried within farmlands. And you'll see through this series of panoramics that in so many ways, it mirrors a lot of the stories of people that I face. So Tacoma, Washington, Adelanto, California, Otay Mesa outside of San Diego, San Luis in western Arizona, La Palma Detention Center in Florence, Arizona, in the middle of the desert. Another detention center in Florence, which is the Service Processing Center, which the detention center abuts right up to a huge senior mobile home park, or T. Don Hutto facility, which has been a women's/family facility outside of Austin in Taylor, Texas, or Dilley, the compound in Dilley, which is one of three historical family detention centers in Dilley, Texas, West Texas Detention Center in Sierra Blanca, or Tornillo, Tent City in Tornillo, which was up for over a year but was taken down in early 2019. I mean, this is just a selection of some of these places that are housing and detaining immigrants. The last two this is from Aurora Processing outside of Denver, and Farmville in Farmville, Virginia. That pretty much encompasses the part one of the essay, American Gulag. But then I dive into part two, which really takes a look at takes on a traditional, more reportage look at how immigration detention is affecting people and the stories that people have from their trajectory of arriving at the US border and having to wait for any number of different reasons. I mean, obviously, recently it's been because of the MPP protocols. But then what happens to them once they get sucked into the immigration detention system, disappear within that system, and are traumatized within that system, ultimately with the intention of the system having one goal at hand, and that is deportation. The project looks at what are other ways that people feel like they're being detained, and once they're released, oftentimes, tens of thousands of people are released from the immigration detention system in the United States with GPS monitors that they end up having to then do check-ins. The monitors actually talk to them. They have their appointments with ICE through those monitors, and people feel detained in that sense too. The work also looks at the kind of the justice system and just how the Kafka-esque legal system that is put in place in terms of how people are faced with detention in the United States, the asylum process as well. I mean, this part two of American Gulag takes a really, really broad kind of holistic look at immigration detention from family separation from a multiple different perspectives, from family detention in 2018 to the botched efforts of reunification of so many of those children, to families that had no other choice but to self-detain themselves in sanctuary places for fear of being arrested by ICE and detained and eventually deported, like this woman who had spent over a year self-detaining herself in sanctuary in a church outside of Phoenix. To then the work that's being done by civil society groups, like this group of volunteers who are there with a family of 4 who are going to meet and visit a loved one in detention. American Gulag takes a look at multiple different perspectives that are all related, not just to the physicality of detention, but to the repercussions that are wrapped all around with this particular issue. From, like I said, from the moment people reach the US border to the moment they're actually deported, which is this particular scene of a busload of people being released from immigration detention in Arizona and then being deported. And the final and third part of the work that I've done in the United States for American Gulag looks at not just what's happening on the southern border, but what's happening on the interior of the country, and particularly during the Trump years. What's happening in middle America, which often is so overshadowed by all the attention that is given to the southern border and what's happening there. What I found through the work that I did is trying to investigate and show the repercussions of certain ICE raids on community, like this ICE raid that happened on June 5th in 2018 in Norwalk, Ohio, where 114 people were arrested, which tore apart families during that particular time. Or this huge, massive raid that took place on August 8th, 2018 in O'Neill, in various areas in O'Neill, Nebraska, where 120 people were arrested and detained at 6 different work sites, including this site at Bartlett Cattle Company outside of O'Neill in Nebraska. And the trauma that then ends up filtering in through communities themselves, not only families, by these kind of policies, by empty churches that are usually filled because people are for fear of wanting to go outside. For apartment complexes like this in Marion, where small little raids end up happening. But over a period of time, those small raids funnel in a fear into communities that can be totally paralyzing. This happened at an apartment in Marion, and this was a group of 6 workers that were living in an apartment. And the ICE raid happened right before they were about ready to leave for work. And this is what the apartment looked like right after they had left and been arrested, just hours after. Or even small families living by themselves who, because of a traffic stop, then end up finding their parent being detained by ICE, and it breaks up their family as well. Like this family that was living in Elmore, Ohio, or this young woman in Wichita, Kansas, or this young baby whose father was detained and then eventually deported. This child is a US citizen, by the way, outside of Denver. And you have those very, very short moments where you have something that good has happened, and that is the release of a family member. The final and third part, which I'll get through really quick here, the final and the third part of American Gulag is an extension of what I've just been talking about. And that is that what we see along the southern border and on the west coast of these massive privately run detention prisons in reality, what we find in the Midwest are not so much the presence of those, but what we see is a vast network of county jails all throughout the Midwest that are renting out bed space to ICE to actually detain immigrants. And the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue are coming into these small counties, primarily Republican counties, where jails and county sheriff's offices are earning a huge amount of revenue from the Department of Homeland Security to detain people for ICE, like this county jail in Seneca, Ohio, in Tiffin, Ohio, or this county jail in Monroe County in Monroe, Michigan, or in this county jail in the middle of a cornfield, soybean field in Pulaski, Illinois, or in Brazil, Indiana, or in Eldora, Iowa, or Montgomery, Missouri, or Cottonwood Falls, Kansas, Plattsmouth, Nebraska, and Mountain Home, Idaho. These county jails, over 100 of them, are scattered all across the interior of the United States, all earning a huge amount of revenue from the Department of Homeland Security for renting out bed space for ICE. This is a vast crucial part of the huge network of immigration detention centers and sites across the United States, which the United States has the largest immigration detention system in the world. So this project tries to not only show what the immigration detention system looks like from large cities to small little towns and counties that are impoverished, to the stories of people that find themselves getting, unfortunately, sucked into that system, made invisible in so many ways, separated from the world, isolated physically, but not only from mentally and emotionally from family and from access to the justice system in so many ways, and the repercussions that they have on individuals, families, and communities around the United States. And there'll be more being released over the next 2 months. Most of this work from the Midwest is unpublished. This is the first time people have really been seeing it. But I'll stop my presentation from there. But I hope that gives you a little bit of the essence of what this project is all about, what it's trying to achieve, and trying to kind of take a little bit of a different approach towards things. I don't really consider myself fitting into breaking news, and I work really, really slow. And this particular project tries to fill in a lot of the gaps that the mainstream media and journalism, my colleagues in journalism, don't particularly have either the time or the resources to be able to investigate and uncover the way that I think all of us wish we could.
Greg, thank you so much for the work that you're doing and sharing your powerful images. Could you tell us what you found to be the greatest challenge in carrying out this project?
You know, I mean, I think that probably the biggest challenge is having to navigate kind of this permeating sense of fear that people end up encountering throughout these systems. You know, I mean, even when people are released, it's that fear of knowing that they have another 2 years left before their asylum case actually goes through the courts and is heard, and the insecurity that they face during that particular time. So for me, probably the biggest challenge has been just trying to navigate that level of fear that people have and telling them who I am and what this project is about, and going from there. I mean, I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that I've faced with this project so far. But you know, fortunately, because people get to know me and they know that how kind of slow the paces at which I work and the way that materials are released, I think people become confident in kind of the methodology behind how I work, and they end up opening up. And yeah, I mean, I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that I've faced so far with the project.
Did the U.S. government officials, did they allow you inside any of the facilities in the United States?
No, I have not been inside any of the detention facilities in the United States. But to be honest with you, there's also a rationale behind that in terms of how I'm working. I mean, for one, if I was to get inside of a detention center, the freedom to be able to speak openly with someone is so small. And I almost feel like the approach that I've taken has provided this extra level of security for people to be able to talk openly. You know, the reality of it is that the experience that people have in detention lives with them long after they've actually left the walls of that detention center. And people reflect on that experience. It's embedded in them. And they reflect on that experience so intimately when I can talk with them when they're in an environment of relative safety and security. I think the other side of not really actively pursuing trying to get access to detention centers is that there are pictures out there of that my colleagues have taken of people in detention centers. And to be honest with you, I think that they serve that particular purpose. I also feel that there's one other layer, and that is if you talk with anybody who's in detention, one of the most traumatic experiences that they face is having to shed their civilian clothing and then be forced into the persona of someone who is wrapped in criminality by having to put on a uniform in one of these detention centers. That is a common denominator amongst every single person that I've ever talked to, is that traumatic experience of having to wear a color-coded uniform makes them feel like they're being seen and treated as a criminal, which most of them, almost all of them, are not. So for me to be able to take photographs of people in color-coded uniforms in a detention center, in some kind of way for me, almost ends up reinforcing that stigmatization of criminality that people are trying so much against, trying to be perceived as. So those are a number of the reasons that, I mean, I hope it answers your questions. Long answer, but yeah, that I haven't been in detention centers, but there's been reasons for it.
Yeah, and when you talk about, interviewing these people afterwards, how many of these interviews have you conducted in preparing American Gulag?
I've counted that there's well over 100 hours worth of interviews. I think over right now, there's, I mean, roughly about 100, a little over 100 different people. And those can comprise a whole different demographics. That can comprise somebody who is in detention, somebody who has been recently released from detention and is talking about that experience, a family member who has somebody who's in detention, because I talk with families. It also involves interviews with immigration lawyers about their experience and frustration, and actually the trauma that they encounter by having to go up against this system. And oftentimes we know that the success rate in asylum claims is so small in the United States. And the reality is that I feel that immigration lawyers have just it has a really important perspective on shedding light on the frustrations of the system and how they're having to deal with trying to successfully defend their clients. And it can also be the voices of people who are in visitation programs. They provide that one lifeline, a very, very valuable lifeline that people in detention have to feeling like a human being and to the outside world. And that experience for visitors is traumatic. So all these interviews encompass a number of different people. And I'd have to say that, some of the most powerful experiences I've had would be, take, for example, I mean, I've talked with people who have been in detention for 3 years and then deported back to Somalia or Sierra Leone or Cameroon or Ghana. And I've had hours-long WhatsApp calls with people who have been recently deported back to these home countries that they fled years ago, and now they're in hiding, trying to figure out what to do with their lives. So that's what I mean. Like, the testimonies are a huge part of this particular project, and they span hundreds of hours, over 100 hours worth.
Greg, I have one more question for you, and then I want to introduce Michael. And I don't want you to be offended by this, but we've gone through this really brutal period of time where tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were deported, even though they were not known to break any criminal law in the United States, other than arguably a misdemeanor of entering without documentation. And you're taking pictures of them and you're publishing those pictures of them. Are there ethical issues with what you're doing? Is it voyeuristic? Are you placing their lives, their freedom at risk to the extent that they could be said to have freedom, in the state where they're existing, where they're under the constant threat of deportation? How do you address those ethical issues?
I mean, I've learned a lot through working on the issue of statelessness all those years that, stateless people, including the people who I've met during this project, are some of the most vulnerable people out there. And the responsibility that I have to take, the extra steps, extra layers of responsibility, is something that I've learned about. So the fact is, you'll see that in the photographs that I take of people that are like more portrait kind of work, a lot of those photographs are obscured. I use composition and the way of light to be able to obscure people's identities. It could be with shadows, it could be with silhouettes, it could be just in the way that I'm framing. Very rarely, even though a person would say they're totally comfortable with me showing their face, Very rarely will I ever show an actual person's face for those very reasons. But to be honest with you, I feel that when you mix a photograph with someone's testimony, with the words that they have spoken, that is powerful enough. And the project might ask a lot of people, because I'm not looking for a photograph that tries to capture everything all in one image. There's a lot of context that is wrapped around these images. That's a conscious decision that I've made. So for one, I do not think the pictures would be considered voyeuristic. And I also feel like as many of the ethical calculations that I can make based on what I know and my experiences over the past 20 years provide enough of a visual frame of reference for somebody to connect themselves with that person, but also then wrap that in their voice and testimony as well, to take that experience or that connection that somebody has to a whole another kind of different level.
Thank you so much, Greg. Michael, you're kind of Greg's counterpart. You've also been doing this work for years, and you have been one of the only private citizens in the country to actually go inside the facilities where children and families are being kept. And rather than capturing what you've seen with photographs, you're capturing what you've seen and what they've experienced with legal declarations, and using those to support litigation on behalf of the children and families, and also to prepare reports, human rights reports for Human Rights Watch. Can you tell me a little bit about, when you see Greg's images from the outside, how do they compare with what you see on the inside when you're interviewing these same people as they're being detained, but the children and families?
Well, I think really you're right to say that it's the same kind of work viewed through a different lens. A lot of the themes that Greg has talked about, the idea of desolation, the idea of uncertainty, the idea of what it means to be locked up for something that is either not a crime or is not a very serious crime in any event, certainly not a crime for which most people have been charged. All of these things take a real toll on people. And I think what doesn't come through necessarily visually when I view the facilities on the inside is what it means for people internally, like what this does to mental well-being. I think that the physical layouts vary from place to place. I think that they vary in terms of the amount of cleanliness and access to the basics that one might have. I would have said maybe 5 years ago that countries like the United States tend to do better on the physical aspects and much worse on the mental health side of things. On mental health, there's no question that they do very, very badly. On the physical side of things, you and I, Warren, were both in a couple of these detention centers that were housing large numbers of unaccompanied kids, serious overcrowding, no access to things that most people would consider basics like clean clothes, showers, the opportunity to brush your teeth, to use the toilet with some semblance of dignity. All of that was absent in several of the border detention facilities you and I were in on, for example, in Clint, Texas. They vary considerably, but there were moments, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, where even the physical conditions in US detention was really, really bad. I guess 2 things that I do want to mention are that, to reinforce what Greg said, is that the United States operates an extraordinarily broad detention system for migration. And it's actually 4 or 5 detention systems. But that means that people are locked up in a lot of places in a lot of different ways in a system that is not, isn't the criminal system, and therefore doesn't have some of the protections of criminal law. You don't have the right to a lawyer. You don't have the right necessarily to even to call your family or friends and let them know where you are. If you're a child, in theory, you're supposed to get specific protection, but that often doesn't happen. And the fact that it is both incredibly opaque, very difficult to see on the inside, and also so fragmented means that it is really, really difficult to appreciate the extent to which people are locked up, the numbers, and even the length of time they might be locked up for. And then the second thing, the final thing that I just wanted to say is that all of these things are, the whole environment of dealing with the migration system is inherently traumatic. People are coming often having experienced significant dangers in their home countries that lead them to flee in search of protection. And that's particularly true for those coming from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, but from other countries as well. They're facing high risks on the journey. They're then locked into detention at a point when they think they have reached safety, and finally subjected to intense and prolonged uncertainty. And all of those things take an incredible mental toll on people. And so I'm hearing again and again from people that they really feel that they're at the end of their tether as a result of the combination of experiences, but concretely what they're facing once they arrive in the United States.
So Michael, you are an international expert on the human rights of children. Do they have a right to be here? What are their rights when they arrive to the United States? And is there a way to use the human rights framework to defend their rights?
You're asking the easy questions. There's a really well-developed body of international standards that the U.S. government played a significant role in creating and promoting, in making sure was written down in a robust way, and then refused to endorse, refused to sign up to. So there's always been a tension in the United States between a willingness to contribute to the development of international standards and a reluctance to consider this country bound by it, which creates these difficulties where we can point to in every other country in the world a very, very clear set of standards about protection, the need for enhanced care, the idea of best interests of the child, which really comes from US family court settings. We can point to these things and say, you can therefore, applying these general principles, also look to what the concrete setting is and talk about things like the need for family unity, the need for care and protection when children are traveling on their own without their usual caregivers. And talk about the idea of having access to asylum, to refugee protection, to these kinds of internationally recognized forms of protection for people who are fleeing persecution, serious harm. So the short answer to your question is nearly everywhere else in the world is a matter of international law. And to a certain extent in the United States, as the result of domestic standards, children should be receiving care and protection that is more than adults in the same circumstances would get. And they should also be getting access to opportunities to be able to make their case for asylum, for protection. The US, as many places around the world do, the US is falling down in how it's implementing those kinds of legal standards. But also, in particular, I think we have to acknowledge over the last 4 years, there's been a real effort to erode those protections, to dismantle those protections, which puts children in a particularly vulnerable place once they arrive in the United States.
So there's a question in the Q&A and it's addressed to Greg, but I also know that Michael has some firsthand knowledge on this particular question. And so Greg, if it's okay, I'd like to pose it to both of you. But, you know, the person in the Q&A asked if there are some disabled people that have tried to seek asylum here and in other countries. Most visibly are people in wheelchairs, however, they could be deaf, blind, have cognitive difficulties, etc. What happens to these people in these detention centers? Have you talked to any disabled asylum seekers or families with a disabled child? So Greg, if you want to go first, that would be great. And then Michael, if you could share a little bit about some of your work with families who have disabled children and trying to get them into a safe place in the United States, that would be great. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. To be honest with you, I have not talked with anybody who is disabled, who's been in an immigration detention facility, at least in the United States. And so I don't particularly feel like I'm the best person to kind of respond to that. So I wouldn't really have much to go offer. I'd leave that up to Michael, because I think Michael will be able to say, you know, at least you know, how someone with disabilities like that, what equality they have in terms of their access to the legal system, the asylum process, based on those particular, that, you know, there was a couple different challenging disabilities that was in that question. So
Michael, would you be willing to talk about some of the children that we've encountered under the MPP research and what their experiences were?
Yeah, I was going to say something about that, and then talk more generally about people and children who are living with disabilities and what that means, you know, sort of in terms of what should be afforded them in terms of access to the process and access to conditions of living that are in conditions of dignity and ones that meet needs. So there, as people will perhaps remember, one of the initiatives of the previous administration was to implement a longstanding provision in US immigration law that was enacted in 1996, was never actually fully implemented because of concerns, I think really valid concerns about how you really do it, which is to say that people who are arriving from adjacent countries, there are two, one is Canada, the other one is Mexico, could be returned to those countries to await their US asylum hearings in the neighboring country. And I think when it was enacted, the idea was that maybe there would be sort of like video setups and, you know, the opportunity for people to you know, it wasn't really clear what they were going to do with it. In any event, the previous administration implemented it unilaterally without discussion with Mexico, or without full discussion with Mexico in any event, and sent over 70,000 people, including, we know, large numbers of families with children, to border towns in Mexico that were very dangerous, very overcrowded, particularly dangerous for people who were clearly not Mexican, who, for in a variety of ways, accent, dress, where they were living, the fact that they were hauling suitcases around made them visibly or otherwise very easy to target, to spot and target. And among them included children and adults living with disabilities. Some, as the person writing the question said, some were physical disabilities and some were psychosocial, intellectual disabilities. And I think the short answer is, you know, there was no plan for how to accommodate any people. There was very, very little capacity among the privately run shelters, mostly church groups and similar, you know, Good Samaritans who were operating these entities, and real constraints in terms of the physical sort of infrastructure, accessibility issues, as you can imagine, with people who are facing mobility issues. Virtually no practical access to education of any kind, much less appropriate education for people, children who would need, who had specific needs, and therefore serious problems, right? I think, you know, Warren, you probably have other examples in mind, but I'm just thinking about the day-to-day struggles of navigating a shelter using a wheelchair, and what that means for access to showers, what that means for access to the toilet. Going about your daily life becomes that much more of a struggle, and it is deeply humiliating, of course, to have to depend on others for these basic needs. One further thing on this is just that I have colleagues who work in a separate division that we have, which is on the rights of persons with disabilities, and among other things, they went into a Mexican federally run shelter for people placed in this Remain in Mexico asylum program in Ciudad Juarez, across from El Paso. I also visited it at a separate point, but they visited it with a specific goal of examining what its setup was for people living with disabilities. And as you can imagine, found a whole range of shortcomings of all kinds. One final thing that I wanted to mention is that just in the way that the United States played a leading role in helping develop international standards for children, it has done so with the development of an international treaty called the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is incredibly progressive, was drafted started with a starting premise of nothing about us without us. That is, people with disabilities participated from the onset in its formulation. And it draws in significant respects on the Americans with Disability Act and various other local pieces of legislation that in many respects are model pieces of lawmaking that, if implemented, would make a real difference. Here again, we have a resistance on the part of the US to adhere to those standards.
So I have one more question for both of you, Greg and Michael. Before I do, I'm going to hop in to that question because, as you know, Michael, we encountered that one little boy and in Juarez, and he had cognitive disabilities and had what appeared to be a viable claim for asylum in the United States. And under the MPP program, there was supposed to be an exemption for children with special needs. And he clearly, visibly, you could tell, and when we interacted with him, you could tell that this was a child with special needs. And he was sexually assaulted on 3 occasions in the MPP program by not having, a safe environment where he was being kept. And he had family in the United States. And then you'll remember that in some of our interviews in Tijuana, there was a little boy with hemophilia who, for every one of their court appearances in the asylum case, he was detained and would be bumped, bruised, etc., and the bleeding wouldn't stop. And it was life-threatening. And we had to work really, really hard with human rights organizations in the United States to get them into a family home in the United States where they could be safe based upon their disabilities. But without that fighting, that never would have happened. Or the boy with cerebral palsy, whose dad was separated from him, and the dad was being deported, and the little boy was being kept in the hospital in San Diego. And we had to have the hospital personnel intervene in order to have the family reunited again so that they could care for this little 4-year-old who was only, about 28 pounds, who had cerebral palsy and could not speak and could not walk, etc. So you see, the children, the families with disabilities all the time, and the fact that despite the United States' express commitment to accommodate these children, that we've witnessed time and again that they're not doing it, and we have to go to extraordinary circumstances to get the United States to fulfill its commitment. The little boy with who is cognitively disabled, Border Patrol interviewed him 3 times, and they gave him an IQ test, and they asked him a total of 12 questions, including things such as how old are you and what is your name. He got 10 of those questions wrong, including how old he was and what his name is, and yet they said he had a normal IQ. And so that's what we're up against, is what Greg called this Kafkaesque system. So Greg and Michael, as we wrap up, tell me, what is your role? I mean, how do you bring together lawyers and artists and other creative types to inform the public about what's going on? Like, what is the role that people like Greg can have? Greg, I think that you have an obvious gift, but you're not a legal expert. You're not able to bring lawsuits on behalf of this. Like, what is your role And Michael, what do you think are your shortcomings? Why do you work so much with artists and creative types to raise awareness about what's happening in these facilities in the United States and elsewhere around the world? So Greg, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I kind of view my role as being one part of something that is basically continuing to inject new information into the conversation. The news cycle today is, we all know, it's crazy. It changes from one week to the next. A story bursts into the news and then it evaporates just as fast. And also at the speed of which news and information is being consumed and delivered to people. I've always viewed myself as being somebody that creates work that allows people, or actually asks people, to slow down, so that they can walk away with a little bit more of a deeper understanding about the nuances of these very, very complex stories. And that can be through a variety of different ways. I mean, that can be through releasing the work on the website, or releasing the work through these series of self-published journals, or through collaborations with composers or theater or whatever it is. I mean, any way to be able to get the work out, I feel is kind of my role. I've always viewed myself as being somebody in my work as filling in these big, huge gaps that I feel are left behind by the demands of the news cycle. But more than that, I think it's also, and this ties in directly to kind of this conversation, but also some of the points that both of you have just brought up. And that is that, there's something that Michael said that really resonated with me, that I don't think people in the US fully understand and appreciate. And that's one of the things that this project, one of the many things this project and my work is trying to do, is that there is almost this myth that if you reach the United States, you will have sanctuary and sanctuary, safety and sanctuary. There is this myth within people, citizens in the United States, that we are this society that is so welcoming to other peoples who are, fleeing persecution to a degree. But like I said, this particular project, and particularly after having lived abroad and worked abroad for 14 years, and then moving back to North America and seeing everything happening, there is a hypocrisy in so much about US policy and the ethos of US society in this sense. And I say that because it ties back to what Michael said. You have people from Central America, or even particularly people from Africa or the Middle East, who are so traumatized by any number of reasons, and they have the courage to be able to sustain themselves and get to the US border through Central America, through cartels, through all number of different types of problems, to get to the United States. And actually, most of the people that I've talked to are people that have walked up to a point of entry and have presented themselves to a US border official. Not somebody who's jumped over the fence, but somebody who has actually walked up, knowing what their case is, and said, I am handing myself to you, presenting myself, not surrendering, because surrendering takes on a connotation of you've done something wrong, but I am presenting myself to you with my case. And almost on all occasions of people that I have talked to, the US system has totally betrayed them, failed them, and being in the United States through the detention system is actually where they've reached their breaking point, not in the Darien Gap in Panama or in Mexico, but it's in a detention center having to deal with the systems of the United States. So I think that's one of the major roles that I serve with this project. And also an extension of that is, these policies, immigration, let's say, and government, it's very opaque for people. And Michael said this too. There is this amorphous kind of undefinable shape that the US immigration system takes on, as well as government policies everywhere in the world, whether it be the UK or Malaysia or Mexico or here. There's nothing, it's so opaque that you can't place your finger on it. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with this particular project is to actually provide something that will translate some kind of form and shape, not only physically to this, but also to the psychological element of all of this and the repercussion that it has on human beings. So that's where, again, long answer to a very simple question, but that's really where I feel like my role is in this project and within the larger conversation about immigration policy and asylum policy in the United States and other places.
Michael, I know that you've been working on a children's book that just was published in April. Previous to that, you contributed to a comics book. You've also supported some art exhibits. Can you tell us a little bit why you're making such an intention to partner with artists and other creative types?
Well, I think there's a lot of value in having different voices and different perspectives, people coming from different disciplines to talk about the same things. We just see things differently, or we're able to express things in a way that is different from and therefore complements what each other is doing. I'm a lawyer. Lawyers are traditionally fairly good at some kinds of communication and terrible at many kinds of communication. In particular, kind of conveying what is happening to people who are non-specialists, right? So it is one thing to be able to go to court and make a compelling legal argument, but it's quite something else to explain to a general audience why we need to change the direction that the government is heading and mobilize broad support for that. So just as I'm working with psychologists and medical professionals and other kinds of people with subject matter expertise on children's development issues, for example, I'm also seeking to work with people who can approach these issues in a way that really compellingly conveys what their experiences are, and in particular, focuses the message on the children's own words, brings out the children's own voices, which I think too often are obscured or neglected in these kinds of discussions.
So thank you so much, Greg, for sharing your powerful photography, and Michael for talking a little bit about your work at the border. Derek, I'm going to hand it back to you and just say thank you, World Oregon, for hosting all of us today. So Derek, it's all yours.
Thanks, Warren, and thank you, Greg and Michael, for your very powerful images and words, and really for all of you diving into such a powerful and challenging topic. And we look forward to doing more programs in the future. We thank you for audience for joining us in today. This will be posted up later on YouTube, probably next week, and you can share it out with others interested in learning more about this. Take a look in the chat before we sign off. Got some links there for all the different projects that were mentioned, both the artistic as well as the legal ones. And we look forward to seeing you at our future upcoming programs. Again, at worldoregon.org, you can find out about all of our upcoming webinars. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you so much for joining us. Wish you a good afternoon.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, World Oregon.